What if everything you believe about human origins, the fossil record, the evolutionary timeline, the story of how we came to walk upright on this planet, was not a lie exactly, but an incomplete answer to a question we never thought to ask? I did not work at Area 51 because I believed in extraterrestrial life. I worked there because I had a particular skill set that made me useful to people who operated far beyond the boundaries of public knowledge. And what I learned in those sterile corridors beneath the Nevada desert was not what I expected. It was not about spacecraft or technology or invasion scenarios. It was about us, about where we came from, about what we are. My name does not matter. The clearance level I held does not matter. What matters is that I was there, in those rooms, standing close enough to touch beings that should not exist according to every framework of reality we are taught to accept. And one of them, one species among the 7 I encountered, told me something that I have spent every day since trying to understand, trying to disprove, trying to reconcile with the person I was before I knew. They told me we do not belong here. Not in the way conspiracy theorists imagine, not as some cosmic accident or alien experiment gone wrong, but as something else, something that makes the question of extraterrestrial life almost trivial compared to the question of what we actually are. I cannot prove what I am about to tell you. The documentation that might corroborate my account exists in places I can no longer access, if it still exists at all. The people who assigned me to that facility would deny my presence there. The beings I spoke with, if that is even the right word for what we did, cannot testify on my behalf. But I am telling you this because the weight of not telling it has become heavier than the consequences of breaking a silence I was ordered to keep. If you choose to dismiss this as fiction or fantasy or the delusions of someone who has spent too long thinking about impossible things, I will understand. I would have done the same before I walked into Sublevel 7 for the first time. But if some part of you has always felt that the story we tell ourselves about human history does not quite fit, if you have ever looked at the archaeological record and sensed gaps that feel too precise to be accidental, then perhaps you will recognize in my account the same unsettling recognition I experienced when standing 3 feet from a being whose existence should have been impossible, hearing it explain that we are not native to this world. I was recruited into the linguistics program in 2009, not for Area 51, not initially. My work began at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, where I specialized in pattern recognition across unrelated language families. My particular talent, if you can call it that, was not fluency in many languages, but the ability to identify structural similarities beneath surface differences. I could look at syntax and phoneme distribution and see connections that suggested common origins even when no historical contact between cultures could be documented. This skill made me useful in intelligence work. Decrypting communications, analyzing propaganda, building psychological profiles based on linguistic markers, mundane applications of an unusual aptitude. The first hint that my work might extend beyond conventional intelligence came in 2012 during a routine security review. I was asked to sign a series of non-disclosure agreements that went far beyond the standard military classification protocols. The language in these documents was unusual. Provisions for information that challenged conventional scientific understanding, clauses about non-human intelligence patterns, penalties for disclosure that included not just legal consequences, but what the documents termed permanent professional isolation. I signed them, not because I believed in what they implied, but because refusing would have ended my career and left me with questions I would spend the rest of my life wondering about. 6 weeks later, I received orders to report to a facility that was not listed on any map I could access. The coordinates placed it in the Nevada desert, in a region I had flown over many times without knowing what existed beneath that featureless expanse of rock and sand. The briefing before my first deployment was conducted in a windowless room in Virginia by 3 people who did not give me their names. They told me I had been selected for a translation project that required absolute discretion and psychological stability. They told me the work would challenge my assumptions about communication, consciousness, and the nature of intelligence itself. They did not tell me I would be translating languages spoken by beings that were not human. That revelation came 3 days later, after I had been transported to the facility under conditions that made it clear I was crossing into a realm that operated by rules I did not yet understand. The flight took place at night. I was the only passenger. The aircraft had no windows. The pilot did not speak to me. When we landed, I was escorted through a series of security checkpoints that felt less like military protocol and more like a gradual separation from the world I knew. By the time I reached sub-level 7, I understood that whatever I was about to encounter would not fit into any category of experience I had been trained to interpret. The facility itself was not what people imagine when they think of Area 51. There were no dramatic hangar bays with massive spacecraft under floodlights. No scientists in white coats rushing between laboratories. The architecture was aggressively mundane: polished concrete floors, recessed lighting that cast no shadows, walls painted in shades of gray that seemed designed to prevent any sense of orientation or time. What disturbed me most in those first hours was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the quality of it. The air felt heavy, as if sound itself was being absorbed rather than reflected. My footsteps made almost no noise. When the escort who led me through the corridor spoke, his voice sounded muffled, intimate, as if he were speaking directly into my ear, even when he was several feet away. That alone told me we were not in a conventional military facility. The acoustic dampening was too precise, too complete. It suggested technology designed to contain something that could not be allowed to resonate beyond these walls. The first briefing about the actual nature of my assignment took place in a conference room on sub-level 4. There were 6 of us: linguists, cognitive scientists, one cultural anthropologist whose specialty I did not immediately understand. We were shown a presentation that began with satellite imagery of various locations around the world, then transitioned into something else entirely: archaeological anomalies that did not fit into accepted timelines, structures that required technological capabilities their civilizations supposedly did not possess, artifacts that suggested knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that should not have been available to cultures working with stone tools and primitive metallurgy. Then the presentation shifted again. Images of symbols that appeared in multiple locations, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, yet sharing structural elements that could not be explained by independent development or cultural contact. The briefing officer, a woman whose rank insignia I did not recognize, told us that these symbols were not created by humans. They were messages, instructions, markers left by intelligences that had been present on Earth long before recorded history, and in some cases, were still present. She told us that we had been brought to this facility to help decode these messages, to learn the languages of beings that had been in contact with human civilization for longer than civilization itself had existed. She told us that 7 distinct non-human species had been documented and were, in varying capacities, accessible for direct communication. Then she asked if anyone wanted to withdraw from the program. No one moved. Not because we were all brave or committed to some higher purpose, but because the moment she said those words, 7 distinct non-human species, the world we had known ceased to exist. Leaving the program would not restore our ignorance. It would only isolate us with knowledge we could not share and questions we could not pursue. So we stayed. The beings were not kept in cells. That is important to understand. The facility was not a prison in any conventional sense. It was, in the language the staff used, a contact zone, a space designed to facilitate communication between intelligences that experienced reality in fundamentally different ways. My first direct encounter was with a species designated as Type 3 in the facility's classification system. I was not given a name for them. Names, I was told, implied linguistic categories that might not apply. The beings did not use language the way we do. They communicated through pattern arrangements: visual, spatial, temporal. What we perceived as communication was translation rendered by interface systems I did not fully understand, filtered through human cognitive architecture in ways that allowed us to interpret their signals as something resembling speech. The room where I met them was large and empty, except for a central platform where the Type 3 entities would materialize, that is the only word I have for it, at scheduled intervals. The platform was not solid. It looked like contained liquid light, perpetually moving but maintaining a stable shape. I was instructed to stand at a marked position 10 feet from the platform, to remain still, to observe without attempting to initiate contact. First encounters, I was told, were about acclimation, about allowing both parties to adjust to each other's presence before attempting communication. The Type 3 beings arrived without sound. One moment, the platform was empty, glowing faintly in the dim room. The next moment, they were there. I do not have language adequate to describe their appearance. They were not humanoid. They were not biological in any sense I could recognize. They looked like geometric forms that moved through space in ways that seemed to defy perspective, changing size and shape depending on the angle of observation, existing in more dimensions than I could perceive simultaneously. What unsettled me was not their strangeness. It was their patience. They did not react to my presence, did not acknowledge me in any way I could detect. They simply remained on the platform, their forms shifting slowly, almost rhythmically, while I stood frozen at my designated position, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. After 30 minutes, they vanished. The platform returned to its empty state. The session was over. I was escorted back to the preparation room, where I sat alone for 20 minutes before anyone came to debrief me. When the supervisor finally arrived, she asked me only one question. "Did you feel anything?" I told her the truth. I felt observed. Not watched. Observed. As if the beings were not looking at me but through me, cataloging something about my presence that I could not identify or understand. She nodded as if this was the expected response. "That," she said, "is how they communicate. By observing what you are, not what you say." The protocols for contact were extensive and non-negotiable. Before I was allowed into active translation sessions, I underwent 6 weeks of training that felt less like preparation and more like psychological conditioning. The rules were presented not as safety guidelines, but as absolute requirements for maintaining cognitive stability in the presence of non-human intelligence. Never attempt to touch the beings or their interface platforms. Physical contact could result in what the documents termed consciousness breach, a state where human neural patterns became entangled with non-human perception frameworks. Personnel who had violated this rule, I was told, required months of cognitive rehabilitation and sometimes never fully recovered their original sense of self. Never looked directly at certain species for extended periods. Type 5 entities in particular emitted something. Radiation, pattern frequencies. The briefings were deliberately vague, that could induce altered states of consciousness if exposure exceeded recommended durations. The effects ranged from temporal disorientation to complete loss of episodic memory. Never assume you understand what is being communicated. The translation interfaces provided approximations, not equivalents. Concepts that seemed clear might be fundamentally mistranslated. Beings that seemed benevolent or hostile might be neither. Human emotional and moral categories, we were reminded repeatedly, did not necessarily apply to intelligences that had evolved along completely different trajectories. Never discuss specific session content outside designated debriefing contexts. Not for security reasons, although security was paramount, but because attempting to describe certain concepts without proper preparation could destabilize the listener's cognitive framework. Language itself, we were told, was a carrier for ideas that could alter consciousness. Certain information could not be safely transmitted through casual conversation. Never ask about the being's origins or purposes unless they volunteered such information. Questions about where they came from, why they were here, what they wanted from us, these were considered high-risk inquiries that could trigger responses the facility was not equipped to manage. The beings were accessible for contact, but they were not prisoners. They were not obligated to answer our questions. And there were topics that, according to the briefings, they had made clear were not open for discussion. That last rule was the one that troubled me most. It implied that negotiations had already taken place, that agreements existed, that the relationship between these beings and the facility's operators, and by extension, humanity, was more complex than simple observation or scientific curiosity. We were not studying them. We were coordinating with them. My role as translator began in earnest during the 3rd month. By then, I had been exposed to all 7 species under controlled conditions. I had learned the basic patterns of their communication systems. I had developed what the facility psychologists called cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between human and non-human frameworks of meaning without losing coherence. Type 3 became my primary assignment. Their communication style, pattern-based, visual, operating across multiple simultaneous channels, aligned with my particular aptitudes. I could observe their displays, recognize recurring structural elements, begin to map their signals onto human conceptual categories. The sessions followed a predictable rhythm. I would enter the contact chamber. The Type 3 beings would materialize on their platform. For several minutes, they would simply observe me, their geometric forms shifting in patterns that the interface system would translate into rough approximations of concepts: recognition, curiosity, assessment. Then the actual communication would begin. They would generate displays, intricate arrangements of light and form that appeared in the air between us. I would study these displays, identifying elements that seemed to correspond to ideas or questions. The interface system would provide suggested translations, which I would refine based on context and previous sessions. It was not conversation as humans understand it. It was more like negotiated interpretation. They would present a pattern. I would propose a meaning. They would adjust the pattern to confirm or correct my interpretation. Gradually, over days and weeks, we developed a shared vocabulary of understood concepts. Most of what we discussed was mundane. They seemed interested in human social structures, decision-making processes, the ways we organized information. They asked, if that is the right word, about mathematics, art, religious belief. They wanted to understand how humans created meaning from experience. I assumed this was anthropological curiosity, an advanced intelligence documenting a less developed one. I was wrong. The shift happened during my 47th session with Type 3, 6 months into the assignment. Long enough that I had begun to feel comfortable with the strangeness, to treat the beings almost as colleagues engaged in mutual research. The session began normally. They materialized. We exchanged the greeting patterns we had established. Then they generated a display I had not seen before. It was complex. Multiple layers of interlocking forms that seemed to depict relationships between categories I could not immediately identify. The interface system struggled to provide translation. The suggested meanings were fragmentary, contradictory: origin, transplant, adaptation, incompatibility, deliberate. I studied the display for several minutes, trying to find a coherent interpretation. Finally, I asked them to clarify. They did not simplify the display, they added to it. New patterns appeared, and these I recognized. Symbols representing Earth, the solar system. Timeline markers indicating vast stretches of time, and then, emerging from a different part of the display, symbols representing humans, but the connection between them was wrong. In every other context, when the Type 3 beings depicted relationships between species and their environments, the linking patterns suggested natural emergence, evolution, development within an ecosystem. The pattern connecting humans to Earth was different. It suggested introduction, placement, something that did not originate in the system it now inhabited. I must have stood there for 10 minutes, staring at that display, feeling something in my understanding of reality begin to shift. The Type 3 beings remained motionless on their platform, waiting. Finally, I asked the question that I suspect they had been waiting for me to ask since the first session. Are you saying humans are not from Earth? The display changed again. New patterns appeared, and the interface system provided a translation that felt less like language and more like direct conceptual transfer. Not originated, introduced. Time, approximately 200,000 years. Purpose, adaptation assessment. Status, ongoing. I remember my hands starting to shake. I remember the weight of those words settling into my consciousness, not as information, but as transformation. Because if what they were telling me was true, if humans had not evolved on this planet but had been placed here, then every framework I had for understanding human history, human nature, human purpose was suddenly inadequate. I asked them where humans came from. They did not answer. Or rather, they generated a pattern that the interface could not translate into anything resembling language. The closest approximation was something like elsewhere combined with irrelevant and forgotten. I asked them who had brought us here. Again, no clear answer. Just patterns suggesting collective decision, multiple participants, authority no longer present. I asked them why. And that is when they told me something that I have spent every day since trying to understand. The display they generated in response to my question about why humans were on Earth was the most complex I had ever seen them produce. It took me almost 20 minutes to parse even a fraction of its meaning, and I am certain I missed layers of significance that were beyond my capacity to interpret. But what came through, what the interface system managed to translate, was this: Earth is not a planet that naturally produces what we would call complex civilization. The biosphere is stable, diverse, capable of supporting sophisticated life forms. But something about the planet's specific conditions, its magnetic field patterns, its orbital characteristics, something in the deep structure of how matter and energy interact here, creates a constraint on the development of certain kinds of consciousness. The beings were careful to clarify this. It was not that Earth prevented intelligence. The fossil record shows the development of complex nervous systems, problem-solving behavior, even rudimentary tool use among various species. But something about this planetary environment inhibits the leap to what they called recursive abstract modeling, the ability to think about thinking, to create symbolic systems that represent concepts detached from immediate experience, to build civilizations based on transmitted knowledge rather than instinctive behavior. In their framework, Earth is a world that produces sophisticated animals, but not civilizations. Except we are here, humans, with our language and mathematics and art and technology, with our ability to conceive of ourselves as separate from the natural world, to imagine futures that do not yet exist, to create meaning that has no immediate survival function. We are, in their assessment, an anomaly, not because we evolved in unusual ways, but because we evolved at all. The Type 3 beings showed me patterns indicating that in the standard progression of planetary development, across thousands of surveyed worlds, across timeframes measured in hundreds of millions of years, worlds with Earth's specific characteristics do not independently produce species like humans. They produce sophisticated ecosystems, complex predator-prey relationships, intelligence sufficient for survival in dynamic environments, but not civilizations, not us. So the question became, if Earth does not naturally produce civilizations, and yet we are here building cities and spacecraft and art museums, how did we come to exist? Their answer, we were brought here, not as conquerors or colonists, but as an experiment, an assessment of whether a species developed elsewhere, under conditions that naturally supported the leap to civilization, could adapt to a planetary environment that would not have produced such a species independently. We were, in their terminology, introduced biomass, a transplanted intelligence, placed on Earth approximately 200,000 years ago, which, not coincidentally, corresponds exactly to the timeline when anatomically modern humans appear in the archaeological record, with no clear precursor species that adequately explains the cognitive leap we represent. I did not respond immediately. I could not. The implications were too vast, too destabilizing. If what they were telling me was accurate, then everything we believed about human origins, about our place in the evolutionary tree, about our relationship to other species on Earth, about the meaning of consciousness itself, was fundamentally incomplete. We were not Earth's children. We were immigrants to a world that had not invited us, placed here by intelligences whose motives we did not know and whose existence we had only recently begun to suspect. The Type 3 beings must have sensed my distress, if that is even an appropriate word for what they perceived, because the next pattern they generated was simpler, almost reassuring in its directness. Not invasion, not colonization. Adaptation trial. You were placed. You survived. You belong now. But that raised even more questions. If we were brought here as some kind of experiment, where was the original human population? Where had we come from before Earth? And why us? Why this particular species, with these particular traits, adapted for conditions that did not exist on the planet where we ended up? I asked them these questions in various forms over the following sessions, but they never provided direct answers. Sometimes the pattern suggested that the information was restricted, not by them, but by agreements made between multiple parties long before this facility existed. Sometimes the pattern suggested that the knowledge itself was lost, that the beings who had initiated the project were no longer present or no longer capable of explaining their decisions. But one thing became clear through repeated inquiry. We were not the only ones. Earth has hosted multiple transplanted species over geological time. Some succeeded in adapting, some did not. Some left evidence that we interpret as evolutionary transitions, but that were actually population replacements. The Type 3 beings showed me patterns suggesting that certain extinct hominid species were earlier attempts, trial populations that could not make the cognitive leap required for long-term survival in Earth's conditions. We, Homo sapiens sapiens, were the successful adaptation. We learned to thrive in an environment that should not have produced us. We developed civilizations despite planetary constraints that should have kept us locked in sophisticated animal behavior, and that success was apparently significant enough that multiple non-human intelligences had been monitoring us ever since. After the revelation about human origins, my relationship with the facility changed. I was moved to a different housing unit with enhanced security protocols. My communication with the outside world, already limited, was reduced to a single monitored phone call every 2 weeks. The debriefing sessions after each contact became longer, more intense, more focused on my psychological state than on the content of the communications. It became clear that I had crossed a threshold. I now possessed information that the facility's operators considered highly sensitive. Not because it was classified in conventional military terms, but because it challenged foundational assumptions about human identity in ways that could destabilize individuals who were not prepared to integrate such knowledge. The medical staff began asking me questions that seemed designed to assess whether I was experiencing what they called ontological fracture, a psychological condition where exposure to information that invalidates core beliefs creates a cascade of cognitive dissonance that can result in complete loss of functional stability. Did I still feel connected to my identity as a human being? Did I experience a sense of belonging to Earth's biosphere? Did I find meaning in cultural traditions and social relationships that were based on assumptions about human origins that I now knew were incomplete? I told them the truth. I did not know. Some days I felt exactly the same as before. I went about my work, ate meals, maintained relationships with the small community of researchers at the facility. Human life continued to feel real and immediate and meaningful. Other days I felt like I was observing myself from a distance, watching a species that had been placed on this planet like laboratory specimens, acting out behaviors and building civilizations without understanding that we were test subjects in an experiment whose parameters we could not even identify. The psychologists assured me this was normal, that everyone who learned what I had learned went through a period of disorientation, that eventually I would reach what they called integrated understanding, a state where I could hold both my immediate human experience and the larger cosmic context in simultaneous awareness without one invalidating the other. But integration required time, and time meant continuing to work at the facility, continuing to engage with the Type 3 beings, continuing to learn things that each pushed my understanding of reality further from the comfortable certainties I had grown up with. The facility offered me a choice. I could request reassignment to a different department, working with information that did not directly challenge human origins, or I could continue with the Type 3 contact sessions, pursuing the questions they had opened, accepting that each answer would likely generate new and more destabilizing questions. If I left the program, I would be required to undergo a protocol designed to help me compartmentalize what I had learned. Not memory erasure. They assured me that was not possible with current technology, but therapeutic intervention that would help me create cognitive boundaries between my knowledge of human origins and my ability to function in normal society. I would leave the facility, resume something resembling a normal life, carry the knowledge of what I had learned as a kind of isolating secret that I could acknowledge to myself but never fully integrate into my daily existence. Or I could stay, accept the ontological fracture, pursue understanding, even if it meant permanently altering my relationship to my own humanity. I chose to stay, not because I was brave or committed to some higher truth, but because leaving would have meant accepting that there were questions I was not equipped to answer, realities I could not integrate. And something about that felt like a betrayal of the beings who had been patient enough to teach me. Over the following months, I learned more about the transplantation hypothesis, as I came to think of it. The Type 3 beings were willing to discuss certain aspects of human origins, though always within boundaries that suggested larger agreements I was not party to. They told me that the original human population, the source population from which Earth's humans were derived, existed on a different world under different conditions. They would not tell me where, or whether that population still existed, or what had happened to the civilization that had developed there. What they did tell me was that the original environment was more conducive to abstract thought. Whatever planetary characteristics inhibit recursive consciousness on Earth were not present in that original setting. Humans had emerged naturally there, developing symbolic thought and civilization without the constraints that make such development anomalous in Earth's biosphere. But something had happened. They were vague about the details that made it necessary or desirable to relocate a human population to Earth. The word necessary appeared repeatedly in the patterns they generated, suggesting this was not simply scientific curiosity, but a response to circumstances that required action. The relocated population was small, several thousand individuals according to the timelines they showed me. Genetically diverse enough to sustain a long-term population, but small enough that genetic bottleneck effects should have been observable. And indeed, modern genetic studies have found exactly such evidence. The data suggests that all living humans descend from a small founding population that went through a severe bottleneck approximately 200,000 years ago. Mainstream science interprets this as evidence of near-extinction events, climate catastrophes, population crashes that nearly eliminated the species. The Type 3 beings suggested a different interpretation, not a bottleneck from massive die-off, but the genetic signature of a small transplanted group that became the ancestors of all subsequent humans. The early generations struggled. The patterns showed repeated population failures, groups that could not adapt to Earth's cognitive constraints, that retained the psychological architecture suited for their original environment, but could not thrive in the new one. Death rates were high. Successful reproduction was limited. For tens of thousands of years, humanity teetered on the edge of extinction, not because of environmental catastrophes, but because we were fundamentally mismatched to the planetary consciousness field we had been placed within. But gradually, something shifted. Whether through genetic adaptation or mimetic evolution or some other process, the Type 3 beings could not translate adequately. Humans began to develop what they called compensatory frameworks. We created language systems that were more complex than strictly necessary for survival. We developed ritual behaviors that reinforced abstract concepts through repetition. We built social structures that transmitted accumulated knowledge across generations. We externalized our consciousness through art and story and symbol, creating a kind of cognitive scaffolding that allowed us to maintain abstract thought in an environment that naturally suppressed it. We adapted, not by changing Earth, but by changing ourselves in ways that allowed us to maintain our consciousness despite planetary conditions that worked against it. And that adaptation, according to the Type 3 beings, was itself remarkable, because it suggested that consciousness was not as fragile as the beings who had initiated the transplantation had assumed. That intelligent species could develop strategies to maintain abstract thought even in environments that did not naturally support it. We were, in their assessment, a successful experiment, proof that civilization could take root in places that would not independently produce it. But an experiment implies experimenters, and that raised the question I was most afraid to ask. I waited until my 93rd session to ask directly about the beings who had initiated the human transplantation. I had learned by then that the Type 3 entities were not themselves responsible. They were observers, documentarians, part of a much larger network of intelligences that monitored various evolutionary experiments across multiple worlds. But they were not the decision makers. When I finally asked who had brought humans to Earth and why, the Type 3 beings generated a pattern more complex than anything I had seen before. The interface system struggled to translate it. What emerged was fragmentary, uncertain, a mosaic of concepts that did not quite cohere into a linear explanation. Multiple parties, collective authority, consensus decision-making across intelligences with different priorities and frameworks for understanding what constitutes ethical intervention in planetary development. The beings suggested that there was no single organization, no galactic government or cosmic authority that regulated such decisions. Instead, there were informal agreements between various intelligence networks, protocols that had emerged over vast timescales based on observations of countless planetary systems and the patterns of how consciousness emerged or failed to emerge under different conditions. Earth had been identified as a world with stable biosphere conditions but cognitive inhibition characteristics, a good candidate for adaptation trials. And humans, the original population, had been identified as a species with resilience traits that might allow them to overcome Earth's constraints. The decision to attempt the transplantation had been made, according to the patterns, not by a single species, but by a council of multiple intelligences, each contributing expertise about different aspects of planetary adaptation, genetic sustainability, consciousness transfer, and long-term monitoring protocols. The Type 3 beings themselves were part of that monitoring network. They had been observing human development on Earth for the entire 200,000-year duration of our presence here, recording our progress, documenting our adaptations, assessing whether the experiment could be considered successful. When I asked what criteria defined success, they showed me patterns that translated roughly as sustained civilization, conscious self-reflection, capacity for choice beyond instinct, recognition of existential questions. By those metrics, humans had succeeded. We had not only survived, but flourished. We had built complex societies, developed technologies, created art and philosophy and science. We had become, in their assessment, a legitimate civilization, despite existing on a planet that should not have produced such a thing. But there was a darker implication embedded in those patterns. If we were being monitored, assessed, documented, then our existence was not entirely autonomous. Our civilization had developed under observation by intelligences who viewed us as an ongoing experiment. Were we free, or were we specimens whose apparent freedom existed within parameters established by beings we had not known existed until we stumbled upon evidence of their presence? The Type 3 beings did not answer that question directly, but they showed me patterns suggesting that the monitoring was passive, that the council who had initiated the transplantation had agreed to non-interference except under specific catastrophic conditions that had not yet materialized. We were on our own, for better or worse. The experiment was no longer controlled. We had been given this planet, adapted to its constraints, and now our future was our own to determine. Except for one thing. During my final month at the facility, the Type 3 beings began showing me patterns that the interface system translated as warnings, not threats. These beings did not communicate threat in any form I could recognize, but cautions about trajectories humans were currently following. The patterns indicated that our adaptation to Earth had been successful in allowing us to develop civilization, but that adaptation had come with costs. Our compensatory frameworks, language, culture, technology, had allowed us to maintain abstract consciousness in an environment that naturally suppressed it. But those frameworks were also creating insulation between humans and the planetary systems we existed within. We were becoming disconnected from Earth even while living on it. Our technologies were allowing us to ignore the constraints that had shaped our development. We were modifying the environment to suit our inherited preferences rather than continuing to adapt to the world we actually inhabited. And that trajectory, according to the patterns, was unsustainable, not because it would destroy Earth. The planet would continue regardless of what humans did to its surface conditions, but because it would eventually destroy the cognitive scaffolding that allowed us to maintain civilization in the first place. The warning was not about climate change or nuclear war or any of the apocalyptic scenarios humans worry about. It was more fundamental. It was about what happens when a transplanted species forgets it was transplanted, begins to treat its adopted world as if it were naturally designed for them, and dismantles the very adaptations that allowed them to survive in a foreign environment. The Type 3 beings showed me projections, not predictions, but probability matrices based on observed patterns across multiple civilizations on multiple worlds. Species that successfully adapted to transplantation environments and then stabilized into sustainable civilizations, and species that adapted successfully but then overextended, creating technological and social structures that severed their connection to the planetary systems that constrained and shaped their consciousness. Those latter species, according to the patterns, invariably faced what the interface translated as cognitive collapse. A state where the compensatory frameworks failed, where abstract thought became unsustainable, where civilization degraded not through external catastrophe but through loss of the very consciousness that made civilization possible. Humanity, in their assessment, was trending toward that outcome. Not immediately, not inevitably, but trending. The patterns suggested we had perhaps a century before the trajectory became irreversible. Time enough to recognize what we were doing. Time enough to choose different priorities. Time enough to remember that we were not native to this world and that our presence here was the result of careful adaptation rather than natural right. Whether we would use that time wisely, the Type 3 beings could not predict. They only showed me the patterns and waited for me to understand what they implied. I completed my contract at the facility in late 2017. By then, I had spent 5 years working with the Type 3 beings, learning about human origins, accumulating knowledge that had no place in the world outside those subterranean corridors. The facility offered me the option to stay, to continue the research, to help develop protocols for sharing this information with wider human populations in ways that would not cause mass ontological fracture. I declined, not because I was afraid of the work, but because I had begun to recognize that remaining at the facility meant accepting a permanent separation from human society. I would know things that isolated me from my species. I would carry perspectives that made normal human concerns seem trivial or misguided. I would become, in effect, an observer of humanity rather than a participant in it. The exit protocols were extensive, months of therapy designed to help me integrate what I had learned. Cognitive exercises to prevent the knowledge from destabilizing my sense of identity, legal agreements reinforcing the absolute prohibition on disclosure of specific information. I signed the documents, completed the therapy, underwent the evaluations confirming I was psychologically stable enough to re-enter normal society, and then I left. The transition was harder than anyone at the facility had prepared me for. Not because I could not function in normal life, I could, but because everything felt different. Every conversation about human history, human nature, human purpose carried assumptions I now knew were incomplete. Every news story about environmental policy or technological development or space exploration had implications that no one around me could see. I was not allowed to tell anyone what I had learned, not friends, not family, not colleagues. I carried the knowledge of human origins as a kind of private burden, a secret that shaped my understanding of everything while remaining invisible to everyone I interacted with. For a while, I tried to continue research in related fields, academic linguistics, cognitive science, consciousness studies. I thought maybe I could find ways to hint at what I knew, to nudge human understanding in directions that would eventually converge with the truths I had learned. But the isolation became unbearable. I was not a scientist anymore. I was a witness who could not testify, a translator who could not share the most important translations I had ever made. So I stopped trying. I took a job with no connection to my previous work. I moved to a different city. I built a life that did not require me to think about extraterrestrial contact or human origins or the cognitive constraints of planetary consciousness fields. And for a few years, I convinced myself that this was sustainable. I am breaking my silence, not because I believe you will necessarily accept what I am telling you. I am breaking it because the alternative, carrying this knowledge alone until I die, has become unendurable. The Type 3 beings told me that humans were placed on Earth as an adaptation trial, that our presence here represents a 200,000-year experiment in whether consciousness developed elsewhere could survive in an environment that would not naturally produce it. They told me we succeeded in that adaptation, but they also warned that our success is fragile, that the compensatory frameworks we developed to maintain abstract thought in Earth's conditions are being eroded by our own technological and social choices. If they are right, if we truly are not native to this planet, if our civilization exists only because we adapted in ways that overcame Earth's natural constraints, then our current trajectory may be leading us toward cognitive collapse. Not extinction, not apocalypse, but a slow degradation of the very consciousness that makes us capable of civilization. We would survive, but we would stop being what we are. I cannot prove any of this. The documentation exists in facilities I can no longer access. The beings I communicated with cannot corroborate my account. The people who assigned me to that program would deny my involvement. All I have is my testimony, and the fact that I left a stable career, accepted permanent professional isolation, and am now risking legal consequences to tell you something that may sound like science fiction or delusional fantasy. But consider this. If what I am telling you is even partially true, it explains things that mainstream science struggles to account for. The sudden appearance of anatomically modern humans with no clear evolutionary precursor, the genetic bottleneck evidence suggesting a small founding population, the cognitive leap that separated us from every other hominid species, the fact that our behavior and consciousness seem qualitatively different from all other Earth species despite our biological similarity. Consider also the testimonies of others who have worked in classified programs, the consistent reports of non-human intelligence, the careful management of information about extraterrestrial contact, The resistance to public disclosure, not because the information is dangerous, but because it challenges foundational assumptions about human identity. And finally, consider your own experience. Have you ever felt like human civilization is somehow out of sync with the planet we live on? Like we are operating according to patterns that do not quite fit Earth's rhythms? Like we are remembering something we should not be able to remember, reaching for something we should not be able to conceive? That feeling might not be metaphorical. It might be the echo of our origins, a species-level memory of belonging somewhere else, a consciousness shaped by conditions that no longer exist, struggling to maintain itself in an environment that never intended to produce us. I do not know what happens next. I do not know if this testimony will reach anyone who can act on it. I do not know if the warnings the Type 3 beings showed me are accurate, or if humanity has more time than they estimated to change our trajectory. What I know is that we are not what we thought we were. Our origins are not what we were taught. Our relationship to this planet is more complex, more contingent, more precarious than the comfortable narrative of natural evolution would suggest. We are not Earth's children. We are immigrants, adapters, survivors of a transplantation that should not have worked, but somehow did. And now we face a choice that our ancestors, the original transplanted population, never had to make. Do we continue to distance ourselves from Earth's constraints, building technological cocoons that protect us from the cognitive pressures that shaped our development? Or do we recognize that our adaptation to this world is the foundation of our consciousness, and that preserving that consciousness requires maintaining our connection to planetary systems that make abstract thought difficult but possible? The Type 3 beings could not tell me which choice we will make. They could only show me the patterns and wait for us to understand what we are. I am telling you this now because I believe we are running out of time to understand, because the warnings they showed me are becoming visible in ways that no longer require classified clearance to observe, because human civilization is reaching decision points where our choices will determine not just our survival, but our continuity as conscious beings. You can dismiss this as fantasy, as delusion, as the ravings of someone who spent too long in environments that destabilized their grip on reality. Or you can consider the possibility that I am telling you the truth, that we are not native to Earth, that our presence here is the result of deliberate transplantation, that our civilization exists because we adapted to conditions that should have prevented such development, and that our adaptation, remarkable as it was, is now under threat from our own success. I do not know if you are where I think you are, but if you have read this far, perhaps you are ready to hold this knowledge, to carry it forward, to ask questions that no longer fit comfortably within the frameworks we have built to avoid them. The question is not whether we are alone in the universe. We never were. The question is whether we understand what we are, where we came from, why we are here, and whether we can remember our origins in time to avoid forgetting what makes us capable of asking such questions in the first place. Tell me if this resonates. Tell me where you are. Tell me what you think happens when a transplanted species forgets it was transplanted. Because I spent 5 years learning answers to questions I never thought to ask. And now I cannot stop wondering what it means to be human on a planet that never intended to produce us.